Marisha here, and while I haven't entirely eschewed politics on this channel, this is the first video where the main topic is going to be politics. And normally I wouldn't do this, except that something came up. It was very timely. It's also a consideration of US versus UK, which is something that I do quite frequently on this channel. And so today I'm going to talk about free speech. And the reason this came about is last week, the London Standard published an article by Melanie McDonough, and I'm doing the best that I can with the names of the people that I'm going to be talking about here. Um, that essentially said J.D. Vance was right about free speech in the UK. And as someone who is not a huge fan of the Trump administration, reading the title that J.D. Vance is right about something really piqued my curiosity. And so I felt, well, I have to read this and see what it's about. And essentially, it is about how there are issues with freedom of speech over here in the UK. And she brings up some specific examples. And it must have hit a chord with people because the next week, which was this past Thursday, the Standard had a cover story on free speech featuring another article by Melanie McDonough, wherein she repeats some of the stuff that she said in the first one. So at first I was like, well, why is this is it's not exactly the same thing, but it's very similar. But it must have been, I assume that, yeah, it just really struck a chord and they thought, you know what, let's do a whole like cover story with something by her as well as two other people who I'll talk about in a second. But her next article in this new one is titled There Was More Freedom of Speech 2,500 Years Ago Than in Britain Today. And she starts off by talking about the ancient Greek idea of parrhesia, which is essentially like free speech, that people would gather in the agora. And of course, by people, we mean, influential men, and be able to debate and discuss and talk about whatever they wanted without any kind of censorship. And then she goes through kind of a history of freedom of speech or lack thereof in Britain, going all the way back to Henry VIII, and talking about how he required any books to get past the Privy Council before they could be published because he wanted to make sure no one was publishing anything against his ideas of establishing the Church of England, essentially. And I mean, that was just interesting to me from a historical perspective, and some of the other things that she mentions, I'm just squirreling it away in my brain so that somewhere down the road when I take the UK citizenship test, I'll know these things. But um yeah, she then kind of moves through and talks about John Milton and some of his thoughts on freedom of speech and his championing of it, and then moves on to Salman Rushdie and kind of the lack of free speech that happened as a result of like the satanic verses, right? That there was a fatwa issued against him, and in essence, he kind of was silenced in a way. I think that's a stretch because obviously you can get the satanic verses. It's not like it was completely censored or whatever, but he did have to flee for his life. And then she moves into kind of modern day Britain and she talks about what happened during COVID when anti vax voices were silenced, essentially. Um, and she ultimately argues that that wasn't right because somewhere down the road, AstraZeneca admitted that there were some rare side effects to their vaccine that they weren't really forthcoming about. But as an American, this felt like kind of a stretch because it sounds like in the UK there were some moderate voices that weren't really anti-vax so much as has there really been enough time to test these? Is you know are people being forthcoming about the side effects of it? Is it safe from the perspective of this is a new vaccine? And like that's legit. But in the US, the anti-vax movement was really strong and it was really like far out in left field anti-vax before COVID even was a thing. These were people who were anti-vax because they believed the already debunked idea that vaccines cause autism. It was basically very anti-scientific, very anti-facts, and it's the people who are refusing to vaccinate their kids against measles and are, as a result, there are measles outbreaks happening in Texas and other places in the US, where, 20, 30 years ago, measles weren't a thing. Like, because people were getting vaccinated, enough people were getting vaccinated that it wasn't a problem. But now measles is having a resurgence because a significant number of people hold these absolutely wrong ideas. And like, it has been proven, right, that like the guy who came up with the vaccines cause autism, it was complete bunk, right? And so, as an American reading this, it's just like, well, it's really hard for me to get on board with the idea of like, yeah, let anti-vax people just run rampant with their ideas when you're talking about lives. There were a lot of people who lost their lives to COVID in the US that didn't need to because of anti-vaxxers. Um, so she didn't quite get me there on her side at that point, although I could see, yes, absolutely. If someone is just expressing a view of like, have have these been thoroughly tested, these vaccines? Do we know what the side effects are? That's one thing, right? But the no, all vaccines and just we're just automatically anti-vaccine, that's different. Um, but then she goes into some other examples which are brought up by other people. Um, so I'll talk about those in a second. But she ends with the idea of um, one of the issues with free speech that comes up now is obviously the concept of hate speech. And I feel like we can all agree, I would hope we can all agree, that trying to incite violence, trying to dehumanize people with your speech, that that should be limited, that should be restricted, right? We've always agreed on limitations on free speech. In the US, it's, when you're little and you're talking about this in your civics classes, it's the, shouting fire in a crowded theater argument, slander, libel, things like that, right? We understand that you can't have absolute free speech, right? There do have to be restrictions. But her point is that with hate speech in the UK, it's starting to get more and more oppressive against freedom of speech. And apparently, the law is that whether it's hate speech or not depends on the perspective of the victim. It's basically like if the victim or someone else perceives that this is coming from an idea that someone like is prejudiced against a particular group, then it's hate speech. And it's like, I don't think I agree with her that that is not a good way to establish whether something is hate speech or not, because there are absolutely people out there we know who like to be a victim and will play the victim, and their perception is not reliable. Um, but I want to talk about a couple of the other things that other people brought up in their articles. So the next article was not actually an article, but a transcript of a speech to the House of Lords presented by Lord Eugeny Lebedev. And, the title of his article is I Grew Up in Soviet Russia, right? I know, too well the value of free speech. And so he, of course, starts off talking about kind of the influence of having grown up in Soviet Russia and being very supportive of voices of dissent and how dissent is really important and supporting like Solzhenitsyn and things like that. And then he comes to his life in the UK now that he's living here and what's going on here, and he talks about having the right to offend, right? That we can't we shouldn't try to protect people's feelings with regard to free speech. You should be able to speak your mind. And if somebody finds it offensive, oh, well, they find it offensive, right? That's being offended is not the same thing as being actually threatened, right? Um, and he brings up, and so does the next writer, a case where a man was arrested because he burned a Quran outside the Turkish embassy here in London. And the man was Turkish himself, right? Which is why he chose it. And it was a statement against what he saw as um kind of a growing threat in Turkey of like Islamist influenced or whatever. Um but in the States, burning a book or burning a flag, right? Or, doing something like that is protected under free speech. I mean, I remember when Harry Potter came out and like the right wing evangelicals were just horrified that it was about witchcraft or whatever, and they would have like book burnings and burn Harry Potter books. And of course that's a terrible thing to do. I can't get on board with that, but that's their right to do that. That's their right to free speech. And the fact that someone could, burn a book here and get arrested for it is horrifying to me. Another example that people brought up is there are laws here about um, like protesting at abortion clinics. So you can't even be within a certain distance of an abortion clinic, including a woman who got arrested for standing off to the side with a sign that said, "Here to talk if you want," right? Which is like, I kind of understand if people are having signs that are like, "You're a murderer," and they have graphic images of fetuses and stuff, especially if it's a public place where children are walking by, or if they're yelling at people and again, like threatening. But seriously, someone standing there with a sign that says "Here to talk if you want," the idea that that person would get in trouble with the law, again, absolutely horrifying. And that, in the US, the ACLU would just be like all over that. And so, speaking of the ACLU, the last article is by a man named Toby Young, who is the head of the Free Speech Union. And what I gleaned from the article is that seems like it's kind of an equivalent of the ACLU over here, except focusing specifically on free speech. And he talks about the guy who got arrested for the burning the Quran. He talks about someone else that they helped out who was, I'm just going to read it actually. Um, a retired special constable who was arrested, held in a cell for 8 hours, and released only after he'd agreed to accept a caution, all for a single tweet supporting Israel's right to defend itself. So yeah, they do mention several cases of people getting in trouble for something that they posted online. And again, it's not something that was like, oh, calling for violence or calling for death to whatever. Just something that might be critical of a certain political position or a certain group or whatever. Um, and he talks about, again, also mentioned in the other articles, the fact that there's now something called like a non-crime hate incident where you can get kind of pulled in and questioned for something that you say online. And while it's not a criminal offense, it's put on your record essentially. I'm not exactly sure how that works legally, but apparently it's a thing here. Um, because he talks about um or maybe it's actually I think it's the Lord who talks about this one, where like 30 people are arrested each day under this act that was passed in 2003, and that works out to about 12,000 people a year. And some of those who have had their names recorded in police files are children whose words have been taken down when they were below the age of criminal responsibility and may be held against them for the rest of their lives. So essentially, it sounds like, if I'm understanding these articles correctly, that while what you said isn't going to be like prosecuted at the time, it's kept on file, and it's like then you're on people's radar for this thing that, again, was not enough of a thing to be like illegal. And especially when you're talking about this happening to children, that can be like, I mean, that's just, I feel inexcusable. I do understand that the UK has a program called Prevent, which is an attempt to recognize if people are becoming radicalized and to try to kind of nip it on the bud. As a teacher here, you have to undergo training for Prevent to try to recognize if any of your pupils are exhibiting signs of being radicalized. And I totally get that. I'm on board with that. Of course, you want to try to obviously prevent people from becoming terrorists. However, I think that what I'm reading of what's happening in the UK, they're going to an extreme that tramples on civil rights. Um, and again, Toby Young uh, talks about how there's going to be introduced a banter ban, which is that employers in the hospitality industry have to take all reasonable steps to prevent their employees overhearing conversations or remarks made by customers they might find offensive. So basically, you're in a pub, two people are sitting down with their drinks or whatever, they're talking away, they're chatting about whatever, Israel and Palestine, or they're chatting about immigration, or they're chatting about abortion, or they're chatting about religion, whatever. Any number of things that anybody could get offended by. And someone at the bar staff overhears them, and like that's a problem. And the employer could get in trouble for not taking steps to prevent that person from overhearing something offensive. That is absolutely ridiculous. I cannot believe that, and I hope that this is something, it hasn't come like into play yet, so I hope that there's time for that to get reasoned out. And essentially that's kind of Toby Young's point, which is in the title of the article: if people aren't allowed to speak their minds, how can we change them? Right? Like, you can't change somebody's mind if you don't know what they think. And that the way that we are able to change people's minds about something is to have open dialogue about it, to have that open discourse. And if people are afraid to talk about what they believe, then you no longer have that opportunity. So yeah, as an American reading all of this, I was just kind of horrified. um, but the timing was uncanny because this free speech themed issue of the Standard came out on Thursday. And later that evening in the US, Stephen Colbert announced that Paramount had canceled The Late Show. Um, and even though the official statement from Paramount is that it was a financial decision, pretty much everybody knows, no, there's no way that was the case. The Late Show is the most successful late night show on TV. It's extremely popular. However, this announcement came shortly after Paramount settled a lawsuit with Donald Trump. Um, and Stephen Colbert has been regularly critical of Donald Trump, and he was also critical of Paramount for settling um, the lawsuit that Trump brought against them. And so there's, everybody if you just do a quick Google search of this, if you're from the UK and you're not aware of this, do a quick Google search and you'll see that everyone believes there's no way this was just a purely financial decision. This is absolutely political. This is absolutely the silencing of someone who has been openly critical of Trump and the people who support him and the people who kowtow to him like Paramount did. And in fact, there are already unions getting involved who are pressuring New York to investigate this as essentially um, a politically motivated move and would therefore be illegal, and of course is infringing on freedom of speech, right? Like we all know, right? He's getting in trouble because of things that he said, right? That he should have the freedom to say. And we don't think that it's going to stop there, that there's going to be, that this is setting a pattern of continued silencing of any voices that are critical of Trump or that give ideas that Trump doesn't agree with. It's very similar to him defunding NPR and PBS as well. So yeah, I mean, there's the idea of free speech. As an American, right? We very much like the Voltaire idea of I might not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That's kind of what has been instilled in us from the from when we're little kids and taught about our constitutional rights. And there's a reason it's the First Amendment, the very first one, the most important one: freedom of speech, religion, and assembly. Um, and to see that start getting chipped away at, not just the freedom of speech part, but also freedom of assembly, where people who are protesting are, being arrested even though they're being peaceful and etc. So I think citizens of both the US and the UK should start being alarmed at these positions on freedom of speech and the erosion of that, and start pushing back and contact your MP or contact your senator, wherever you are, and use your voice while you still have it. Next week we'll return to something that's more lighthearted. In the meantime, like, subscribe, tell your friends how gnarly this channel is, and I'll see you next time.